Hi, welcome to this episode of West Trade Review's Postscript interview series. My name is Yael Aldana, and I am Associate Creative Nonfiction Editor here at West Trade. This morning, we are very fortunate to be speaking to Les Standiford. Les has written 25 books, including the John Diehl Detective Series and several books of narrative nonfiction. The latest was Battle for the Big Top. Battle for the Big Top received gold in the category of general nonfiction in the Florida Book Awards. He is a New York Times bestselling author, and several of his books have been turned into films. He's also the director and founder of the creative writing program here at Florida International University. Welcome, Les, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, it's very good to be here, Yael.
First of all, would you mind reading something from one of your books?
I'm going to read a little bit from Last Train to Paradise, which was my first work of narrative nonfiction after I'd written 8 novels. And this book is, well, there's another good reason to read from it. It's still in print 20 years later, going into its 40th printing. I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but I apparently lucked out. It tells the story of really the man who invented Florida, Henry Flagler. And the last amazing thing that Flagler did, besides run the Florida East Coast Railroad down the eastern seaboard of Florida and create a livable, habitable place out of what had been on the maps, literally terra incognita before in the 1880s. The last thing he did was to extend the railroad from Miami to Key West, over 153 miles of what was largely open water. Nothing like that. Had been some railroad building before, but nothing like this, where the challenges, the water and the sea bottom and so forth were so immense, not to mention the 3 hurricanes that struck the project while it was being built. Anyway, it opens up with, I'm sorry to say, the demise of the Key West Railway, the railway across the sea, as it was known. It fell to the onslaught of the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, when it was wiped out. It had been completed in 1912 and stood for a little over 20 years. Never made much money, but passengers loved it. And as anyone who's ever driven down the Keys might expect, to ride down the Keys on a railroad where you couldn't actually see the track beneath you, it looked like you were gliding along on some kind of old-fashioned spaceship. When the train would stop, as drawbridges were up to let ships pass from the Atlantic into the Gulf or the other way around, people would go back to the end of the car and toss a fishing line down, 30 or 40 feet from the bridge into the ocean and go fishing while they were waiting. It got to be a thing to do. Anyway,
Wow.
It's a sort of frightful opening, however, because at the time when this hurricane struck, unexpectedly, we didn't have much by way of early warning systems in 1935. There was a work camp of some 650 veterans living in tents in the Middle Keys on the Matacumbes, and there was no way. There was no road down there, and no boats could travel with this impending storm. But they thought they could send a rescue train down from Miami. This was Labor Day, and there was a lot of traffic, a lot of open drawbridges. But a veteran engineer named J.J. Haycraft was at the controls of the old 447, as it was known, trying to make it to the Isla Mirada station before the hurricane and the storm surge, or what better should be called tidal wave down in the Keys, came ashore. And he was trying to beat that, get most of these people on board, get them out of harm's way. So that's where I'll pick up. Less than 20 miles remain between Haycraft and his destination now, but in that short distance, old 447 was to traverse the great gulf between the known and the never before encountered. The full force of the storm had begun to cross the Matacumbes, now the barometer plunging to record lows, crewmen forced to work their jaws against the sudden popping in their ears. The winds were approaching an ungodly 200 miles per hour, far beyond any forecaster's expectation. The rain was a horizontal force, as painful as a sandblasting, so much moisture aloft that it was difficult to draw a breath. A visitor to one of the work camps that day, Charles Van Vechten, recalls seeing the train that was to have rescued him as it passed him by. You can't imagine how awful it was, he said. At noon, we were told to expect a storm, but that a train would arrive in time to take us out. We packed up in the afternoon and assembled, ready to leave, but the storm hit before the train got there. When it did, I guess it was about 8 p.m., and it was pitch black and blowing like fury. I saw bodies with tree stumps smashed through their chests, heads blown off, twisted arms and legs torn off by flying timber that cut like big knives. When the train came, I dug into the sand to keep from being blown away. I saw the sea creep up the railroad elevation like it was climbing a stairway. The train went on past, heading for the other camps on lower Matacumbe, I guess. Haycraft never saw Van Vechten, of course. From Haycraft's perspective, water covered virtually everything. Over tracks that at once stood 7 feet above sea level, approaching the Islamorada station, breakers were crashing. By all appearances, Haycraft was now piloting a rocking train at 1 to 2 miles per hour across the surface of the ocean itself, and even he had begun to despair. How could anyone survive, he wondered. For that matter, how could he? And then sudden shouts from his crewmen brought him out of his reverie. As if in an awful dream, Haycraft caught sight of desperate faces flashing past the engine bays, the hands of men, women, and children clutching toward the train that was passing them by. Haycraft brought his engine to a halt some 1,500 feet south of the Islamorada station finally, and watched as the crowd stumbled down the rails toward him, women at the front of the pack, as it should be, many of them clutching children by the hand, others pressing infants to their breasts. Something would come of all this effort, then, he thought. Some precious few lives could be saved after all. He would load up this band of human cargo and steam northward out of a watery hell and not let himself think about what wretched others might be clustered on down the line. It was time to cut the losses, get out while the getting was good. And then he felt the iron grip of his fireman upon his shoulder and sensed the panic in the man's unintelligible shouts. Haycraft turned to see what had possessed the fireman, then caught sight of it out of the corner of his own disbelieving eye. At the same instant, he felt the rumble rising up from beneath his feet, a growling that overwhelmed even that of the 447's mighty engine. A dark wall was rushing toward them, a swath of blackness and evil that seemed to swallow the dim illumination of the locomotive's headlamps. Nearly 20 feet tall it was, and it stretched across the horizon from end to end like the sweep of doom itself. A tidal wave, the worst that had ever struck American shores, then and now. Lord have mercy, J.J. Haycraft murmured, his hand going instinctively for the throttle, and everything was dark.
Thank you so much, Les. I remember precisely when I read that. So I am so pleased you were able to read it today. But I'm going to start with an open-ended question. How did you become to be a writer?
Well, I think I always wanted to write. There's a great, I didn't understand that there's great vast gulf to be crossed between wanting to write and being able to write in a way that would pleasure other people. What had made me want to write was the pleasure I got from reading myself. I'd learned to read before I even went to kindergarten. In fact, I had a great advantage over the other kids because I could read the titles of the books on the shelves in the kindergarten, and I could always ask the teacher to read The Little Engine That Could or whatever other title caught my eye, whereas the other kids were always saying that one, that one, that one, and I was more persuasive with the teacher because of that. But wanting to write for me was, I suppose, some kids of my generation went to the magic show and saw the guy saw the pretty lady in half, and that's what they wanted to be. Well, I wanted to be a writer because it seemed just as cool and amazing a thing to me to be able to tell a story that would transport someone to another world as reading did for me. That was the very beginning of it. And so I wrote little things, who knows what they were, and gave them to my teachers all the way through grade school, and they were kind enough to pat me on the head and say, "That's very nice, you keep on going." And later on in college, there were no such things as creative writing programs, or at least I didn't know about them when I was in school. And so I figured I'd continue to write. I was going to be an attorney, and I would write in my spare time. That was the notion. It didn't turn out that way.
So what was your major in college?
I was a psychology major with a minor in English. And everyone thought that would be a very good preparation for law school. And in some ways it was. You have to read a lot of cases in law. And the only problem is I would read the cases as if they were little short stories. And I would get all interested in why people did things. And my law professors were impatient with me because they would want to tell me, well, that's not important. We read these cases to come to understand the principle of the law. This isn't a psychology class. So after a while, I finally realized that I was cut out for a different path.
So you did not get your law degree?
No, I didn't.
What did you end up doing?
Then I went back to graduate school in psychology because, after all, I had a degree in psychology. I had gone to law school at Columbia in New York. I opted to go back to Ohio, which seemed a little less fast-paced to me, and I enrolled in a program, on a PhD program, social psychology. And I thought it was social psychology, sounded like people-oriented, and I thought I might enjoy that. But then I got there, found out it was highly experimental. It was all rats and stats, and it was another mistake. And I talked my way into out of desperation, a creative writing class run by a man named Robert Canzaneri at Ohio State. And after some cajoling, he let me in. And he was deeply suspicious why a psychology major might want to take a creative writing class. And I know he thought it was a mistake. But I did well in that class, so well that he said, you ought to keep after this. And it was the spring semester quarter at the time. And I said, what's being taught this summer? And he said, we don't teach creative writing classes in the summer. Why don't you go to a writer's conference? And I had no idea what a writer's conference was. He explained it, that you go off to some nice place, and beautiful place usually, spend a week or two studying how to write. And he thought I should send off a sample. And I said, where to? And he rolled his eyes. And he said, there's a lot of them. Come on up to the office. I'll show you the brochures. There were a stack of 100 or so of them. And I saw one that featured the sweep of the Wasatch Mountains behind the University of Utah. And that looked like a fabulous place. And I'd always been interested in the West from the time I was a kid. And so I sent them off a story and kind of forgot about it. I was working at a bookstore and I got a letter one day that told me that I'd received a scholarship and to that program. And I don't think I've ever been as happy. Off I went, loved walked into a little bit late on day one and walked into a seminar where a man named George Garrett was talking about life and art and writing. And I listened for about 15 or 20 minutes and a great certainty washed over me. Finally, I realized what I was going to do. I didn't, he was a professor at the University of Virginia at the time, and I think, or maybe it was Hollins College. And I remember thinking at the time, I didn't want to be so much like George Garrett. I would be Garrett. I had a mission in life at long last. I was absolutely what I would do. I would write and I would teach and I would be happy. And you know what? That's turned out to be right. I still didn't know anything about that great gulf that had to be crossed between wanting to be a writer and being able to write. But I had such certainty that I never doubted that I could do it.
And how old were you then?
I would have been 21, 22,
Oh.
22.
So what were your next steps?
Well, I studied in that program, got a master's degree and then a PhD. Wrote a couple of books. Both of them was able to get agents for, even though I was a graduate student. They were big-time agents. One of them represented Martin Cruz Smith, who had just published Gorky Park for $1 million. And I thought, oh boy, I'm going to be the next $1 million sale. And the book I gave that agent went to 35 publishers and rejected by every one of them that said, what else do you have? This is pretty good, but something's wrong with it. We don't know quite what. And that went on for a good long time. After I graduated, I published some stories and articles and poems in little magazines, but I wanted to publish a novel. And finally, well, 7 or 8 years after graduation, I was teaching at Texas El Paso and getting a little burnt out. I hadn't seen a tree in what seemed like forever. That's the desert out there. And I was talking to someone at a party and said, you know, you ought to go to the American Film Institute and study in their screenwriting program. This was William Kittredge, a writer from Montana, married to another writer, a screenwriter named, I'll think of her name in a moment, the woman who'd just come back from that program, who'd written an adaptation of The River Runs Through It, which Robert Redford finally got made. Onyx Smith was her name. And he told me a little bit about it. I had always liked Southern California. I'd spent some time there after graduating from college. And so I applied and I, lo and behold, got in and I went out there and finally, that is where I came to what I know, to learn what I needed to know in order to turn a bunch of fine sentences into something that would pleasure people and make them want to read. I learned how to write at the University of Utah. I learned how to write books that people would want to read at the American Film Institute, because what I learned there was how to tell a story, what a beginning and a middle and an end was. I'd studied plot, Aristotle, in over the course of the English classes I had taken in college, of course. But that's not the same. I liken it to taking an English class where they talk about, if they ever talk about plot, and they often don't. It's like going into a class and the teacher passing out a watch, a wristwatch to everyone, and then proceeds to tell them how to disassemble it, take it apart, and name every part. And you walk out of the class with a bunch of gears and stuff strewn across a tabletop, but you know the name of every one of those gears and parts. But creative writing is to extend this analogy. Learning how to write is like coming into that same classroom and seeing all those gears and parts strewn across the top of a desk. And then the teacher says, and now we will begin to discover how to take all those discrete parts and put them together into a device that not only tells time, but looks beautiful at the same time. And that's the difference between English classes and literary analysis and creative writing, which is the creation of the literature that English department people like to study and dissect. And I'd never had someone teach writing in that way, where I never had a teacher, I think, who himself or herself understood how to put a story together like you'd put watch parts together. But I learned that at the American Film Institute because, as William Goldman has said, screenplays are structure. He meant they are essentially structure. And something he had to learn, even though he was a fine writer when he went out there, he knew nothing about how stories work. And thank God, I came home and from AFI after 2 years out there, took this job at Florida International back in 1985. James W. Hall had just gotten a letter from an agent to whom he'd sent, I think it was his fourth unpublished novel, opining that once again Jim had failed, but he was a good writer. However, if he were willing to do this and do that and change this and change that, he'd have another look. And Jim handed me the letter with a sigh. And as we viewed writing these books as if we were taking a test. And if it didn't work out, if we flunked the test, we threw the book away and started a new book, thinking that maybe this time we'd get it right. The idea of real revision or change was just, we didn't know how to approach all we knew was that somebody had told us no. And so after enough no's, we said, enough with this one, let's go on to the next one. However, when the day that Jim showed me that book, I'll never forget, I said, well, Jim, this, what Nat Sobel, who's the agent who was talking to, was saying here is a lot like what Tony Villani, the screenwriting guru at AFI, used to say about about works that had problems with their storyline. And he looked at me and said, what? Are you suggesting I should do some of these things? I said, we don't have to do all of them, but there's some good points here about plot and character development, the arc of that character development. And I couldn't do it. And I left, and I got home. The phone was ringing. It was Jim. He said, do you really think that there's some? And I said, well, yeah, I do. Long story short, a month later, he showed me the new draft of this book, completely overhauled, and with a focus on character development and a story arc, and had a beginning, middle, and an end. He sent it off to Nat Sobel. Nat Sobel took it on. The first publishing house he sent it to bought it. Within a year, it was published, and the first review was a standalone review on the front page of the Sunday New York Times book review, and it was a rave. And Jim says to this day, if I had not gone to the American Film Institute and learned what it was I learned, he and I both would still be running these unpublished manuscripts through our word processor. And today, Jim and I have upwards of 50 books between us. And as far as I'm concerned, it's all due to what I learned about how to tell a story. And now when I teach, I'll let other people talk about how to write fine sentences and depth of characterization and a million and other important things that one has to learn about writing. I'll talk about what I never was taught and what I think is the essential thing to understand, how to tell a story. Because to try to present a novel to an audience or an editor or a publishing house that doesn't have a story in it would be like trying to sell automobiles without engines. They might look beautiful, but they're not going anywhere. That's, in a nutshell, my odyssey.
It's really interesting because I also took screenwriting, and it was not my favorite class, but I came out of there with a very secure idea of plot and story arc. And I talk about that all the time. And I talk about it to my students.
Good.
And I look at it in my work. And it's a concept that is not fully endorsed, but it's so important to have that beginning, middle, and end, and to understand that arc. So kudos to screenwriting.
I wouldn't be here if I hadn't gone to the American Film Institute, I'm sure of it.
I want to talk about John Diehl. How did John Diehl, the detective, come about?
I had John Diehl was the protagonist of my second novel. And I had an idea about a forest story about a man who found himself crosswise with the mob and was resourceful enough to come out of the conflict alive. Ordinary guy. And I thought, have I ever met any person in real life that I believed had that kind of strength, capability, who wasn't a cop or a martial arts expert or some sort? And then I realized, yes, one guy, his name was Bart Swap. He was a building contractor. He ran his company out of the back end of his pickup truck. I worked with him as a carpenter's helper, working my way through graduate school out in Utah. And Bart Swap was somebody that I believed had the strength of character to withstand this onslaught of a mobster and all of his many minions in a credible way. Bart, when I knew him, was probably in his middle 40s and had never filed an income tax return. So he had managed to go up against the IRS, and I don't know how many of its minions, and never spend a day in jail. So that was, to me, an indication. And because he believed that he did not, it was not incumbent upon him to file an income. It was unfair to ask him to file an income tax return. He was convinced of that, and many times explained why to me. But it was just typical of the kind of guy he was. And I said, that guy, he could go through what I have in mind and make it believable. And so I wrote 8 novels about John Diehl, and John Diehl was vastly different than John Diehl, but I did make him a contractor and the son of a man who had been a very wealthy, very successful contractor in Miami, but who had been accused of some shady dealings. And John Diehl spent most of his life trying to live down the shame of a man whom he loved, but for whom he, felt anger toward and disappointment because he realized he thought his father didn't have to be a criminal to be successful. And so he spent his life on the up and up. And as I often characterize Diehl, the character, he would have had a lot easier time in life if he hadn't been so damned honest.
So, less John deal, but you primarily write narrative nonfiction now. How did that switch come for you?
My agent came down to have Christmas Eve dinner with my wife and I in the year 2000, I think it was, or the beginning of 2000, and told me that the next day he and she were going to go to Key West for the holiday week. And I said, well, I hope you're going to drive. And he said, well, no, we're going to fly. I said, oh, you've got to take that drive. Anybody who's ever been on it will tell you it's one of the prettiest on earth. And I said, well, okay. And they came back to have dinner with us on New Year's Eve and explained how happy they were that I had made that suggestion, how much they enjoyed that drive. Then they discovered that there'd been a railroad built along that route one time. What is now a highway had once been a railroad. Then they got to Key West, went over to the Hemingway house and heard about Hemingway's part in the rescue efforts following the Labor Day storm that had blown the overseas railroad away back in 5. And I said, well, and love the fact, seen the bridges, the old bridges that were still left, and heard that story. And I said, well, I'm happy I told you to take the drive, Scott. And he said, yeah, but it's more than that. I think there's a great story here and you should write it. And I said, well, Scott, I'm a novelist. And he said, listen, a good story is a good story. Doesn't matter whether it's made up or true. And he had me there. And then he said the magic words. Besides, I think I can sell it. And he explained to me that in nonfiction, unlike a novel, you could write a summary, a synopsis of your intended nonfiction project. And publishers have come to understand that while they never know whether they're going to be able to sell any novel or not, unless you're James Patterson ahead of time, they or Stephen King or someone like that, they can predict with a reasonable accuracy what certain kinds of nonfiction will sell, will do. And if they see something that they think has the necessary elements and proposed by a person who seems to have the capability and the access to the material, they can buy it. Well, I put the proposal together, and before you know it, 2 publishers were bidding against each other for it, which was a new development for me. And I thought, hey, maybe there's something in this nonfiction game after all. At any rate, I got the commission and I did this voluminous research and mounds of notes and books and magazines, old magazines stacked on my desk and around the workroom. And I started 3 or 4 versions of The Last Train to Paradise and stopped because I realized that in each case, what I was doing was compiling the world's largest encyclopedia article. And I was boring myself to death, and I knew I would be boring my readers to death as well. And I asked myself the question, what are you going to do with all this stuff, Les? And then the answer came to me, well, you're a storyteller. Tell the story. This is one of the richest men in the world undertakes the engineering challenge of the century, and the worst storm in history blows it all away. That's as good a story as I might have dreamt up. And so I went back to the material, organizing it more in terms of who was this guy, Henry Flagler, and what did he want to do such a crazy thing in the first place for, and structure the book as you might structure a novel, only you just don't make anything up. Everything has to be true. And so that's the formula that I've employed for all the rest of the nonfiction that I've done. Generally, it's larger than life characters doing sort of amazing, larger than life things against tall odds and major obstacles.
I want to talk a little bit about my experience with The Last Train to Paradise, because I read it early in my writing career. And I remember when I came to the end of that first chapter that you read, and here was the looming wave, and I was like, okay, what's going to happen? And then you switched in the next chapter to talk about something more benign. And as a reader, I was like, oh my goodness. But as a writer, I thought, wow, this is what you can do with nonfiction. It doesn't have to be, in 1908, Henry Flagler did this, and then this happened, and then this happened. It really can be exciting. And I saw the power of organizing things in a certain way to really tempt your reader along and to draw them in. So it really changed a lot for me. And I saw the possibilities of nonfiction in a way I had never seen it before. Because, you read like a biography of Greta Garbo, and Greta was born here, and then she did this, and then she came to America. So it's like very step by step. There's not a lot of suspense and whatnot in there. But I want to ask you about another book.
Yeah, sure.
Specifically the title, Meet You in Hell, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and the Bitter Partnership That Transformed America. Now, I've not read that book, but I'm going to read it based on that title. How did you come up with that title?
Oh, because I thought it was startling and would catch anybody's attention. And I thought, and I start the book out with the little anecdote from which it springs, that toward the end of their lives, that these two men who had made American steel what it was, they'd created the American steel industry, which in turn made the United States the undisputed economic leader of the world in the late 19th century. And they had all the money in the world, these two, Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Carnegie. And they'd had this masterfully powerful business concern that they had created, but then they completely fell out, and spent the last 25 years of their lives never spoke to one another. And in fact, it was so bad that as Carnegie, near the end of his life, he sent his butler down the street, Fifth Avenue, from one mansion, Carnegie's mansion, to Frick's mansion, which today is the houses of the Frick collection. That was where Frick lived, in that pile of marble. And Frick opens the letter that Carnegie's butler had brought and said, according to the story, reads it and says, so Carnegie wanted to meet and patch things up and make amends before they died, before they met their maker. And Frick reads this and says to the butler, waiting for the reply, well, tell Carnegie I'll meet him. I'll meet him in hell, where we are both headed. And that was it. That was the last exchange that passed between the two. They both died not long after that. And so I was taken by the question of what on earth could have broken up the most powerful business partnership in all the world, a business partnership that changed the world. How could that be? What could cause it? And the answer is the Homestead Steel Strike of 1892. So we drop back from that opening anecdote to examine that question. How did that partnership get put together in the first place, and then what tore it apart?
The way I think you've chosen to frame this is very interesting, because if you say to me, Andrew Carnegie, Steele, rich people, I'm like, But you say to me a guy that says, I'll meet you in hell. I want to know about that guy. So, you're using the guy, the character of the guy, to like pull us in, and then bringing us into the rest of the story, which is interesting. But without that hook of the character of that guy, we're not along for the ride.
I think that's for all the talk about we've been doing about structure. The stories really are based in stories grow. Any good story grows out of character. If you are not interested in the protagonist, the main character of a story, it is the rare book that's going to get read. That's all there is to it. But you have to understand that without the story, there's no motor. You can't just read about a character saying interesting, clever things for 250 pages. The talented Mr. Ripley is an amazing character, for instance, but Patricia Highsmith knew that she had to tell the story of his ultimate test and downfall. That there was a story there, not a news article. A news article might do a character sketch. Oh, he's fabulous. What an interesting character. Might give you some background into. I've been reading a couple of obituaries that rock and roll rockabilly singer Jerry Lee Lewis, who died this past week, and he's fascinating. And you read these obituaries, to me, makes me recall why I always responded to his music so much as I did. But they're not stories. They're not stories. But an obituary is only, even a New York Times obituary of a famous person is only a couple of pages long. And sure, that'll do you for a couple of pages. But a novel of 300 or 400 or 500 pages requires a character engaged in trying to accomplish something.
Which brings me to my next question. How do you come to pick your projects?
Well, by asking myself, is there a story in there? Do I see the possibility of a story in there? Or is it just information? Is it really, perhaps at most, an extended magazine article, a personality piece, the examination of an idea or an issue? Don't get me wrong, an idea can grow into a story, but even if you're interested in racial injustice, you have to decide, well, who is going to be the person who undergoes whatever happens to show something about racial injustice. The idea without the story, well, that becomes an essay or a philosophy or a book about politics, all of which is maybe interesting to read. But if you're going to send something between two covers that you tell an agent or an editor is a story or a novel, well, there needs to be a story in it. Or they're not, or about 10 or 15 pages into it, they're just going to set it aside and go to the next applicant.
Makes sense.
It doesn't matter how good a writer you are, really, except in the rarest of rare occasions. If you're a genius, you don't have to listen to any of this stuff. Go ahead and do your thing. But if you're doubtful about your genius potential, learn how to tell a story.
So have you picked your next project? Do you want to talk about that?
I'm working right now, something a little different. I'm writing a book about, well, I think I'm going to call it Life and Art. Don and Mira Rebel and the making of the greatest contemporary art collection in the world. And what strikes me about them is that, and they have done this, Rubel family collection, Rubel Museum in Miami. If you doubt me, you just need to take a look. This is a couple that's over the years, over a little more than 50 years, collected, almost 60 now, about 7,500 works of contemporary art worth hundreds of millions of dollars now. And when they started, she was a school teacher and he was a medical student. Usually when you think about great art collections, you think about billionaires who toward the end of their lives start spending their bucks on art, Mellons and Frick and Huntington Hartford and others. But these two people started buying art on the installment plan at $25 a week out of her teacher's salary because they loved it and they wanted to live among art, and they kept going and kept going. Ultimately, Mira became the person who brought Art Basel to Miami, became so influential, so revered in terms of her taste in art, that when she said, I think Art Basel would work, and if it had a satellite in Miami, people actually took her at her word. And Art Basel brings about $500 million a year into the Miami economy today. They, on the other hand, have never sold a single painting that they've bought. They're not in it for the money. They've always been in it for the art. And Don and she both say the purpose of art is to start a conversation. That's why they do it. And I just went up. I was in Washington D.C. Thursday night was the opening of the Rubel Museum D.C. in the Southwest area, formerly stolidly inner city part of D.C. And anybody think that Washington, D.C. needs another museum with the National Gallery and the Hirshhorn and so forth? This is going to be different. Those are somewhat hidebound institutions that cover the gamut of art from the beginnings to the present. The Rubel Museum is of contemporary art. They began collecting in 1964 and are still collecting in the 1920s. And everything, the programming there is much more socially conscious, much more about what art has to do with us today. And I've often told my students about the last person you should pick for a protagonist of your story would be a writer, because writers don't do anything. They observe and they write it down, and in a way, artists and art being painting is something you respond to. It doesn't have to be explained to you, although it's interesting to take an art class. You walk into a gallery and you go, ooh, or you don't. You go into the next room. But the question of, in the end, why do artists make art? And what good is art beyond, its decorative purposes? Why is it important? Well, I think when Don says the purpose of art is to begin a conversation, I want to explore that. And I want to talk about particularly we're talking about the theme here, not the story. The story of how they did this is fascinating. But the reason that I want to write it is because I'm convinced that in art is the only political debate's not going to get us anywhere. But art might get us somewhere. It takes a longer time to change minds and hearts and worlds. But to me, that's the agency that's responsible for change and the maintenance of humanity. So that's the big question that propels me to write this story. What made these people do this amazing thing, and what real value is it? not to mention an amazing story of how they managed to do what they did.
After hearing you explain that, I think art and writing is similar in a way, from my experience, because I've read things that weren't to my taste, and I didn't go woo, and I've read things that I'm not sure I liked, but they have haunted me, and I've still thought about them, years and years after I've read them. And of course, I've read things that I love, and I feel that same way about art. Some pieces really resonate with me, some, I don't remember at all, and some haunt me. So I see a definite correlation between writing and art.
Well, Don tells the story of he was a theoretical mathematician. That was his major in college, and he had a roommate. This was at Duke. He had a roommate who said, there's an art exhibition, modern art. Come on, I want you to go with me. And Don said, I don't know anything about art. I got to study. Come on, you're going to go. And they went into the show. This would have been in the 1950s, early 1950s. And there was one of the works was by Marcel Duchamp. And it was a urinal that had been turned upside down with water flowing out of it, sort of the reverse of what usually happens. A fountain been turned into a fountain. And Don said he was thunderstruck by this. He was absolutely perplexed as to it. He understood that this was thought of now as one of the great groundbreaking pieces of modern art. But he couldn't figure out why. His mathematical mind, but that question never left him, and it's what ultimately propelled him into the life he has, where he's come to be recognized as one of the most important collectors of art who ever lived. People follow them around at art shows, if they go into a gallery, then they'll run, the people who follow them run in and say, who did they just buy? It's whoever it is, they're going to be famous and we're going to make a lot of money off it. Come on.
So they're still alive, unlike some of your previous subjects. Do you plan to interview them closely?
Some of the artists, you mean?
The collectors.
Oh, yes, I've already talked to them at great length. It's one of the reasons that led me to, because they are such interesting characters, I think they'll be interesting to other people in turn.
So this will be really interesting to have living characters versus that you can access versus characters that have died that you can only access through.
It's quite different. It's quite different. I've done it a couple of times. I wrote a book about the making of the Adrian Arsht Center in Miami, and the man who was really responsible for it was an attorney named Parker Thompson, and he was alive. And his friends, many of his friends were alive when I wrote the book. Then I also wrote the book about the detective who finally discovered who was responsible for the kidnapping and murder of Adam Walsh. The book was Bringing Adam Home. And so I had Joe Matthews to talk to, and a number of the people who Matthews had talked to, and the Walshes are still alive, and so forth. And it's different. It is different. You have living sources, but then there's always the question of credibility. If someone's alive and telling you one thing or what they remember, it might be what they remember or what they believe to be true, but it's, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. So you have to, particularly when you're dealing with living people, you have to corroborate crucial facts. And it's all, these are all things that I've come to learn, and what makes writing the writing nonfiction is a little bit more intellectual than writing fiction because, hey, when you need a fact in a novel, I tell my students, just make it up. It's fiction. But you can't do that when you're telling a true story. You have to go find it. And if you can't find it, then you have to think about how to tell the story in a slightly different way.
Why have you never been tempted back to fiction?
Oh, I have been tempted. It's the nonfiction takes a lot longer to research and write. I could write a novel in 6 months. Nonfiction, 2 years. So we'll see. I'm not saying I won't return to fiction. I've got a memoir on the sort of on the back burner that I'm going to try to make a little progress on, even while I'm working on the Rebel book. But the other thing is the Rebels are in their Mira's 79 and Dawn is 82, and I'd like to get this done while they're still alive to tell me they appreciate it. Hopefully.
I'd love to talk about the other hat you wear as a teacher. How did you come to Florida International University?
My classmate in graduate school, James W. Hall, was teaching here. And they wanted to start a creative writing program here, but he did not want to do that. He was not interested in administration, didn't want to do that. But he knew that I had actually begun a creative writing program at Texas El Paso, the first job that I took out of graduate school. And I interviewed with Jim and a couple of colleagues in the English department at the AWP in San Diego that year. And then they brought me down and I interviewed with the whole department and they chose me.
And right at the beginning, what did you put together as the creative writing department? What did it look like?
There was Jim Hall, James W. Hall, and me, and we knew we had to begin the process of putting together a faculty. And so we, over the years, hired John Dufresne, Lynn Barrett, and Campbell McGrath, and that was the core for a number of years. And then we gradually have grown and added others, Julie Wade and Richard Blanco and Deborah Dean, and we cover the waterfront these days, fiction and poetry. That's all we were at first. And now we do nonfiction and personal essay and a little bit of screenwriting and a little bit of everything.
What are some of the common mistakes that you see new writers making?
It depends on the genre, of course. You know, poets have different concerns than fiction writers. Personal essayists have different concerns than general interest nonfiction writers.
What about fiction?
In fiction, in narrative, in any form of prose narrative, whether it's memoir or whether it's general interest nonfiction or whether it's a short story or whether it's a novel, obviously the thing that I didn't understand and what I think most young writers don't understand is the need to, at some point, sit down and ask yourself, what is my story? What is the story here? What story am I trying to tell? Because the story is the motor that's going to make other people interested in the material. And even if that's not what interested you in the material, it is what will interest readers in the material. And, T.S. Eliot used to say of poetry, meaning in poetry is the bone you throw your reader while you do your real work upon them. So his point was, look, poetry has to be on some level comprehensible. It can't just be a bunch of words on paper. That was his feeling. And to me, in terms of the narrative art, story is the bone you give your reader while you do your real work upon them. But without the story, they're not going to sit still to be worked upon.
I think that what your story is about is very important also to creative nonfiction pieces. I do read quite a lot submissions for the magazine, and I think one thing that happens is that something very interesting happened to someone. So they're like, this was really interesting, so I'm going to tell you about it, and it'll be very interesting to you. But if you haven't decided what it's really about, what it means to the author, that doesn't come through to the reader. It has to be about something emotionally. And that is the crux that pulls me in as a reader. And that's something I very often ask myself when I write. What is the point? What is this really about? So I think it's very valuable to think about that.
Well, I think the answer to that is to ask yourself, the way I would put it is, what story am I trying to tell? What is the story I'm trying to tell? And that's it. Maybe it's human nature, but it just seems to be required that you're able to answer that question. It doesn't have to be a happy story. There are tragedies and there are romances, but the story has to be there. That's what is going to happen to this person. What is that person going to do with this drive, this that seems to be motivating her? How's it going to work out? It's very difficult to get a reader to keep going if they're not asking that question.
I agree. And what advice would you give to writers out there? What's your best advice?
Writers, where we all assemble, and the one at the little seminar, I had to get up on stage before all the participants, and one guy who was on the panel was asked this question. His response is, well, best advice I ever heard was quit if you can. And everybody was sort of shocked by that. And then he went on to explain the point that the man from whom he'd heard this advice was trying to make was a simple one, that there was no reason to be trying to do this if it wasn't the most important thing in the world to you. Because fame and fortune and approval and success are very, very unlikely in the writing life. Many are called and few are chosen. And at the end of the day, about the only thing you could count on is your own approval. And if you could live without writing, without doing this, then there are lots of other more certain ways to gain pleasure in this life. But and also, oftentimes students will ask me, well, what do you think? Should I do this? Should I be a writer? Is this crazy? Well, the real answer to that question is, well, quit if you can. You're the only one who can answer that question. Should I do this? Is this worth doing? Well, I don't know. only you can answer that. That's a deeply personal question, and I don't know if that falls under the heading of great advice, but it really gets to the essential question of, what is the value of doing this? Why do we do this? Am I going to change minds or hearts or make any money or be happy? You're the only one who will ever be able to answer that question. Should I be doing this? And it's hard to get to that point. And I think the only certain reward there is in writing is the sense of satisfaction you feel at the end of a day when you got a good sentence or a good phrase or a good chapter, or you finally figured out what you were going to do with that character, or you discovered something you didn't discover when you you didn't know when you sat down to write that day. Those are the reasons to write. And if you get pleasure from that sort of thing, more so than playing tennis, you ought to keep on doing it.
In a way, that wasn't a fair question for me to ask you because it's so open-ended. But I agree with you. I think the best advice I ever heard was don't give up. If you really want this, don't give up.
Well, I think if you really want this, you won't give up.
I agree. So Les, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Just a reminder, West Trade Review is on social media. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And of course, you can like this video, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can buy Les's books wherever books are sold. Thanks again, Les, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Yael.